In March of 1770, a 34-year-old Boston lawyer named John Adams received a visit from a man named James Forrest, who came, by Adams's own later account, with tears in his eyes to ask an almost unthinkable favor. 5 days earlier, a detachment of British soldiers stationed in Boston had opened fire on a crowd of colonists on King Street, killing 5 men in the space of a few chaotic minutes. The city was calling it a massacre before the bodies were even in the ground, before any inquest had established who, precisely, had given the order to fire. Forrest was asking Adams to defend the soldiers. Every instinct of self-preservation available to an ambitious young lawyer in Boston in 1770 argued against taking that case. Adams took it anyway, for a fee he later described as amounting to almost nothing, arguing to a jury of Adams's own furious neighbors that facts are stubborn things, and that no man, not even a British soldier who had just fired into a Boston crowd, could be executed on the strength of public rage alone. He would spend the rest of his career making a version of that same unpopular argument in bigger rooms, against larger crowds, at far greater cost to himself. This is the story of a man who kept choosing to be right over being liked, and what that choice ultimately cost him. If you're enjoying this continuing fact-checked look at the men who built the American presidency, consider subscribing and let me know in the comments which chapter you want told next. Keep this courtroom in mind. It will not be the last time in this story that John Adams stands nearly alone against a room that wants something simpler than the truth: the lawyer who defended his enemies. Picture King Street on the evening of March 5, 1770. A lone British sentry outside the customs house, facing down a crowd of Bostonians who had spent the evening pelting him with snowballs, ice, and oyster shells. The argument over a barber's apprentice's unpaid bill that had started the confrontation hours earlier, long since forgotten in the general fury. Reinforcements arrived, 8 soldiers under Captain Thomas Preston, and in the chaos that followed, muskets fired into the crowd without any single clear order that witnesses could later agree upon. 5 men died, among them Crispus Attucks, a dock worker of African and Native American descent, whose death would make him one of the first casualties of the Revolution, nearly a decade before independence was declared. Boston's Sons of Liberty, Samuel Adams prominent among them, moved immediately to frame the killings as a deliberate massacre, a term that stuck permanently to the event within days. Engravings of the shooting circulated by Paul Revere doing as much as any pamphlet to fix the public's fury in place before a single soldier had even been formally charged. The Boston Massacre trial did not happen quickly. Adams spent the months after King Street watching public opinion harden into something closer to a verdict already reached, while he built, alongside his co-counsel Josiah Quincy, a defense resting on the specific mechanics of what a frightened soldier under a hail of ice and stones is legally permitted to do. The trial of Captain Preston came first, in October of 1770, and ended in acquittal. The trial of the 8 enlisted soldiers followed in December, and Adams's argument to the jury turned on a distinction most of Boston had no patience for that autumn: that a mob throwing objects at armed men standing sentry duty had created a genuine threat to those men's lives, whatever the outcome, and that the law owed the soldiers a fair hearing precisely because the crowd outside the courtroom had already decided they didn't deserve one. Facts, Adams told the jury in words that would follow him the rest of his life, are stubborn things, and whatever our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passion, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. 6 of the 8 soldiers were acquitted outright. 2 were convicted of manslaughter, not murder, and branded on the thumb rather than hanged. Adams's law practice absorbed the hit its critics predicted for a season, clients quietly drifting elsewhere rather than be associated with the massacre's defender. It did not end his career. Within a year, Braintree elected him to the Massachusetts legislature, a signal that at least some of his neighbors read the defense not as betrayal, but as evidence of exactly the kind of character a colony on the edge of revolution might eventually need. Adams himself never treated the case as a youthful misstep to be quietly outgrown. Decades later, an old man looking back across an entire career of larger controversies, he called the Boston Massacre defense one of the best pieces of service he ever rendered his country. A straightforwardly strange thing for a founding father to say about defending British soldiers, unless you understood by then that this was simply how John Adams operated. Keep that instinct in mind. It is about to be tested by something considerably larger than a Boston courtroom. His decision to take the case, and the reasoning behind it, would echo through the rest of his career, in ways the young lawyer standing in that courtroom could not possibly have anticipated. The farm boy who talked his way to Harvard. John Adams was born on October 30th, 1735, in the farming town of Braintree, Massachusetts, the eldest son of a farmer and church deacon who shared his exact name and expected his eldest son to inherit the farm and the modest, respectable obscurity that came with it. Adams disliked farm labor by his own frequent later admission, and disliked it enough that his father, noticing the boy's genuine appetite for books rather than plows, and perhaps recognizing something of his own quiet ambition reflected back at him in his eldest son, arranged for him to prepare for Harvard College instead, an unusual investment for a family of Adams's middling means. He entered Harvard at 16 in 1751 and graduated in 1755, not from any burning early ambition toward law or statecraft, but largely because teaching, the most obvious use of a Harvard degree for a young man without family wealth or connections, turned out to bore him almost as thoroughly as farming had. His college diary, which survives along with an enormous private record Adams kept across most of his adult life, running eventually to more than 50 volumes by the time he was finished with it decades later, shows a young man already prone to harsh self-assessment, recording his own laziness and vanity in the same entries where he resolved, repeatedly and not always successfully, to read more, waste less time, and take his studies more seriously. He tried teaching anyway for a year in Worcester, decided flatly that he hated it, and turned instead to reading law under a local attorney named James Putnam, admitted to the Massachusetts bar in 1758. None of this marked him, in his 20s, as an obvious future president of anything. He was opinionated, restless, privately and repeatedly convinced of his own underappreciated brilliance in a way his own diary entries record with almost comic honesty, and stuck practicing law in small Massachusetts towns while contemporaries with better family names climbed faster. What Adams had instead of inherited standing was a genuine, stubborn belief that being correct mattered more than being popular, a belief that would define every major decision of the next 50 years of his life, starting with a courtroom nobody wanted him anywhere near. One other decision from these early years shaped everything that followed nearly as much as the law did. In 1764, Adams married Abigail Smith, a minister's daughter from Weymouth, 3 years his junior, whom he had courted for several years in a correspondence remarkable enough on its own that historians still mine it for insight into both their characters. Abigail sharper and more politically direct in her letters than most educated women of her era were permitted to be in public. Adams treating her from the start as an intellectual equal rather than merely a domestic partner. The marriage would prove to be the single steadiest institution in a life otherwise defined by long absences, political controversy, and near constant travel. And Abigail's own letters, blunt, funny, and often more perceptive about political character than her husband's, survive today as one of the richest first-hand records of the entire Revolutionary period. The loudest voice for independence. By the time the First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in 1774, Adams had spent most of the previous decade writing pointedly against British taxation policy under a series of pseudonyms, building a reputation as one of Massachusetts' most committed advocates for colonial rights, well before independence itself was a position most delegates were prepared to say out loud. Adams arrived in Philadelphia that first autumn as one of the more radical voices in a room still dominated by delegates hoping for reconciliation with Britain rather than separation from it. And he spent those early sessions doing much of his most important work quietly, in private conversation and committee rooms, gradually building the case for a firmer response than the petitions and boycotts most of his colleagues still favored. In the Second Continental Congress the following year, with the New England militia already besieging British troops in Boston and desperately in need of a unifying command structure, Adams made a calculated political move with consequences far beyond Massachusetts. He rose and nominated a Virginian, George Washington, to command the newly formed Continental Army, a choice that had nothing to do with Washington being the most experienced general available, and everything to do with binding the southern colonies to a war that, without them, risked staying a New England quarrel. It worked exactly as intended. By the summer of 1776, Adams sat on the 5-man committee tasked with drafting a formal Declaration of Independence, alongside Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. Jefferson did the actual writing, a task Adams later insisted he had pushed onto Jefferson deliberately, believing Jefferson's pen was simply better suited to the job and, by his own more candid admission, aware that a Virginian's name on the document would read better to Southern delegates than a New Englander's. What Adams did instead was argue for it, relentlessly, on the floor of Congress through the first days of July 1776, in debates so consequential that Jefferson himself later called Adams the pillar of the Declaration's support in Congress, its ablest advocate and defender, an assessment from Jefferson's own pen that Adams, characteristically, would have agreed with completely. Adams's influence on the Revolution's founding documents extended well past the Declaration itself. Earlier, in 1776, he had anonymously published a pamphlet titled Thoughts on Government, arguing for a specific structure of divided powers, an elected legislature, an independent executive, and an independent judiciary, that several states drew on directly when writing their own new constitutions once independence made royal charters obsolete overnight. Adams was, in effect, helping design the architecture of Republican government at the same time he was arguing for the right to build it at all, a dual role few other delegates in Philadelphia that summer were positioned to play. On July 2, 1776, the vote for independence itself passed with little fanfare compared to the document's later mythology. Adams wrote to Abigail that same week predicting, with more confidence than accuracy about the exact date, that the day would be commemorated by succeeding generations with pomp and parade, bonfires and illuminations, from one end of the continent to the other, a prediction that came true almost precisely, just 2 days later than he had guessed. 10 years an ocean away. The war Adams had helped commit the colonies to would cost him something the battlefield never touched directly, roughly a decade of his own marriage, conducted mostly by letter across an ocean. Congress sent Adams to France in 1778 to help secure the alliance that would prove decisive to the Revolution's outcome, only for Adams to arrive and discover that Benjamin Franklin, already established in Paris and considerably more comfortable in French high society than Adams would ever manage to be, had essentially completed the job. The two men's working relationship in Paris was never an easy one. Adams found Franklin's late mornings, leisurely dinners, and general unwillingness to keep the punctual, orderly schedule Adams considered proper diplomatic conduct almost unbearable to witness at close range, and said so bluntly in letters home, while Franklin, for his part, found Adams's rigid formality and blunt manner poorly suited to a French court that prized wit and ease above almost anything else. The two men managed to work together regardless, out of shared commitment to the cause if not shared temperament, a pattern of productive friction with more charismatic colleagues that would recur throughout Adams's career. The crossing itself nearly killed him. The frigate carrying him to France in 1778 was struck by lightning and chased by British warships, and Adams, along with his 10-year-old son John Quincy, whom he had brought along for the education the voyage and the assignment would provide, arrived in Europe having survived a genuinely dangerous ocean passage before the diplomacy had even begun. Adams returned home briefly, then sailed again in 1779, this time toward a diplomatic assignment considerably harder than Franklin's had been. securing recognition and, crucially, a loan from the Dutch Republic, a mission Congress had given him only vague instructions for, and that Adams pursued largely on his own initiative and stubborn persistence, over more than a year of Dutch officials' polite, repeated refusals. He succeeded in 1782, securing both formal recognition of American independence and a substantial loan that helped keep the fledgling government solvent, an achievement historians have generally ranked among the more underappreciated diplomatic feats of the entire Revolutionary period. Accomplished by a man with no formal diplomatic training, working in a language he did not speak fluently, against a Dutch banking establishment that had every commercial incentive to wait and see which side of the war actually won, before committing capital to either one. He served afterward as one of the 3 American negotiators, alongside Franklin and John Jay, on the Treaty of Paris in 1783, formally ending the war, and then took up an even less comfortable post as the first American minister to the nation his country had just fought a war against, Great Britain, from 1785 to 1788. His first royal audience in that role, standing before King George III himself in 1785 as the official representative of a nation that had spent 8 years in open rebellion against him, produced one of the more quietly remarkable exchanges of the era. The king reportedly telling Adams that he had been the last man in the kingdom to consent to American independence, but that he would also be the last to accept anything less than full friendship between the two nations now that it existed. A diplomatic grace that surprised Adams enough that he recorded the moment carefully in his own correspondence. Across these years, his wife Abigail Adams remained mostly in Massachusetts, raising their children alone, the 2 of them sustaining a marriage through a surviving correspondence that historians now treat as one of the richest documentary records of the entire founding era, sharp, affectionate, and often more politically candid than anything either of them said in public. Adams returned home in 1788, having spent roughly a third of the previous 14 years separated from his own family, in service of a country that was, within a year, about to hand him an office he found almost insultingly small for the sacrifice. The most insignificant office. When the first government under the new Constitution took shape in 1789, Adams was elected the first Vice President of the United States, serving under George Washington for 2 full terms. The office, as the Constitution actually defined it, gave him almost nothing to do beyond presiding over the Senate and casting a tie-breaking vote when the chamber deadlocked, a function Adams performed 29 separate times across 8 years, still the record for any vice president in American history. On questions ranging from the location of the new national capital to the president's own authority to remove appointed officials without Senate approval. Genuinely consequential votes that nonetheless left Adams cast permanently in the role of tiebreaker rather than architect. The frequency of those tie-breaking votes speaks to how closely divided the early Senate often was. It did not speak to any real influence over the executive branch Adams had spent 2 decades of his life helping to build. In a private letter to Abigail that has followed him through 2 centuries of historical retelling, quoted by biographers and schoolchildren alike ever since, Adams wrote that his country had, in its wisdom, contrived for him the most insignificant office that the invention of man had ever contrived or his imagination conceived. A complaint delivered with the particular bitterness of a man who had negotiated with foreign courts and helped draft a nation's founding document, now reduced to breaking ties in a legislative chamber where the real decisions were mostly happening somewhere else. He held the position anyway, for the full 8 years. Watching Washington's cabinet manage the executive business he had spent his career believing he understood better than almost anyone alive. The 8 years were not idle ones politically, even if Adams's own office kept him at a distance from the decisions. He watched, from his seat presiding over the Senate, as the French Revolution's escalating violence split Washington's own cabinet into the same 2 rough factions that would soon organize themselves into Adams's Federalists and Jefferson's Democratic Republicans. Hamilton and Adams, broadly suspicious of the Revolution's descent into terror, and eager for closer ties with Britain. Jefferson broadly sympathetic to France's revolutionary cause despite its excesses. Adams, no longer merely a Massachusetts lawyer arguing points of law, but a national office holder watching a genuine party system take shape around him for the first time in the country's short history, understood by the mid-1790s that whoever followed Washington into the presidency would inherit not a unified government, but two competing visions of what the republic was supposed to become. Keep that frustration in mind. In 4 years, it would be entirely his problem to solve. The first contested election. Washington's decision to decline a third term in 1796 created something the young republic had never actually experienced: a presidential election with no consensus candidate and, for the first time, two organized political factions campaigning openly against each other: Adams's Federalists against Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republicans. The result was close in a way none of Washington's unanimous elections had ever been. Adams won the presidency with 71 electoral votes to Jefferson's 68, a margin of exactly 3 votes in an electoral system that, under the Constitution as originally written, made the second-place finisher automatically the vice president, regardless of party. There was, at this point, no formal party ticket for president and vice president, as later generations would understand it. Electors simply cast 2 votes each for 2 different candidates, with no distinction between the office each vote was meant to secure. A design flaw the framers had not anticipated organized political parties would expose so quickly and so awkwardly. Adams therefore took office in March of 1797, with his most direct political rival serving 1 heartbeat away from the presidency. An arrangement the framers had never anticipated producing anything other than harmony between a nation's 2 most trusted statesmen, and that in practice produced an administration split at its very top between 2 men whose parties disagreed on nearly everything of consequence. The election had exposed a second fracture Adams would spend his presidency navigating as well. Alexander Hamilton, the most influential figure within Adams's own Federalist Party, and a man who had never fully trusted Adams's independence of mind, had attempted behind the scenes in 1796 to maneuver the electoral math so that Adams's own running mate, Thomas Pinckney, might edge out Adams for the presidency itself, a scheme that failed only because enough New England electors, suspicious of Hamilton's motives, deliberately withheld votes from Pinckney to protect Adams's position. Adams learned of the maneuver and the knowledge that the most powerful man in his own party had tried to outflank him before he even took office, colored the entire 4 years that followed. Adams inherited, alongside this awkward arrangement, a deteriorating relationship with revolutionary France, a former wartime ally, now furious at American neutrality in France's own war against Britain, a neutrality Washington himself had proclaimed years earlier, and that Adams was now obligated to defend as his own, and increasingly willing to seize American merchant ships on the open Atlantic to make the point. More than 300 vessels captured or harassed within Adams's first year alone by some contemporary estimates. That crisis, not the vice presidency's daily indignities, would come to define nearly everything else about Adams's single term. Millions for defense. In 1797, Adams dispatched a diplomatic commission, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, John Marshall, and Elbridge Gerry, 3 prominent Federalists and 1 moderate among them chosen deliberately to project unity, to Paris to negotiate a resolution to the escalating maritime crisis with France. What the commissioners encountered instead was a trio of intermediaries, later identified in official dispatches only as X, Y, and Z to protect their anonymity, who informed the Americans that formal negotiations could not even begin without a substantial bribe paid directly to the French foreign minister, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, on top of a separate loan to the French government itself. When Adams released the commissioners' dispatches to Congress in the spring of 1798, the resulting outrage was immediate and overwhelming. The rallying phrase that swept the country that spring, "Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute," popularized by the Federalist Congressman Robert Goodloe Harper and widely, if imprecisely attributed to Pinckney himself, captured a mood approaching genuine war fever. Congress authorized a naval buildup, created a standalone department of the Navy, and began arming merchant vessels for a conflict against France that was, for the next 2 years, fought entirely at sea and entirely without a formal declaration of war, a period historians call the quasi-war. American and French warships and privateers exchanged fire across the Atlantic and the Caribbean for 2 years under this undeclared conflict. Dozens of vessels captured on both sides, without either government ever formally asking its legislature for a declaration that would have made the fighting a war in the constitutional sense. A new patriotic song, Hail Columbia, debuted in Philadelphia that same spring of 1798 to enormous popular acclaim. Performed for an audience that reportedly included Adams himself, its lyrics urging Americans to unite behind an independent nation threatened from abroad, a piece of cultural evidence for just how thoroughly the XYZ affair had reshaped public sentiment in the space of a few months. Adams's public standing, badly strained through his first year in office, surged to its highest point of his presidency. Hamilton and the more aggressive wing of Adams's own Federalist Party, the so-called High Federalists, wanted considerably more than a naval skirmish. They wanted a full land war against France and a greatly expanded standing army that Hamilton, not entirely coincidentally, was maneuvering to command himself. Adams, at the peak of his own popularity, was about to disappoint nearly everyone who had helped put him there. The war he refused to fight. In February of 1799, with his own cabinet largely opposed and Hamilton privately furious, Adams nominated a new peace commission to France, led by William Vans Murray, over the strenuous objections of the High Federalists who had spent the previous year building political momentum toward exactly the full-scale war Adams was now declining to give them. The decision fractured Adams's own party in a way it never fully recovered from. Hamilton, who had spent years building influence within Federalist circles that technically answered to a president he now regarded as an unreliable obstacle, worked actively and often openly against Adams's re-election for the remainder of his term. Adams responded to the growing sense that his own cabinet answered more to Hamilton than to him with a rare display of open confrontation, dismissing his Secretary of State, Timothy Pickering, and his Secretary of War, James McHenry, in the spring of 1800 for what Adams considered disloyalty bordering on outright insubordination, a public break within his own administration that made the party's fracture impossible to disguise any longer. The Peace Commission succeeded, regardless, producing the Convention of 1800, formally ending the quasi-war without the wider conflict Hamilton and his allies had wanted. Adams considered it, by his own later account, the single proudest achievement of his presidency, more consequential in his own estimation than anything else he accomplished in office, and he said so explicitly, telling friends privately that he would rather have his gravestone record the peace with France than any other single act of his career, including the presidency itself. Decades later, drafting instructions for his own gravestone, Adams asked to be remembered specifically for taking upon himself the responsibility for the peace with France in the year 1800, a request that speaks plainly to how he weighed that decision against every other choice of his career, and one his family ultimately honored in the language carved above his tomb in Quincy. This is the payoff of the courtroom this story opened with. In 1770, a young lawyer defended men his neighbors wanted convicted regardless of the facts, because he believed the law owed them a fair hearing. In 1799, a sitting president denied his own party the war it wanted, because he believed the peace was the more defensible outcome, whatever it cost him personally. It cost him, in this second instance, almost everything a politician values. The Federalist Party, divided by Hamilton's open opposition, entered the election of 1800 fractured against itself, and Adams entered it as a president who had just handed his own strongest supporters their most bitter disappointment. 2 old men and a 4th of July. The election of 1800 was, by any measure, the ugliest presidential campaign the young republic had yet produced, a contest fought through newspapers willing to accuse Adams of secretly favoring monarchy and Jefferson of secretly favoring atheism and mob rule, with little restraint on either side. One widely circulated Federalist pamphlet warned that a Jefferson presidency would see Bibles burned and churches closed. Democratic-Republican papers, in turn, mocked Adams as vain, monarchical, and increasingly out of touch, a caricature that stuck to him more than he ever felt was fair, given his own record of resisting exactly the kind of executive overreach his critics accused him of craving. Adams's presidency had also, by 1798, produced the Alien and Sedition Acts, 4 separate laws passed by Federalist-controlled Congress amid the same anti-French war fever the XYZ affair had ignited. The Alien Acts extended the waiting period for citizenship and gave the president broad authority to deport non-citizens he judged dangerous to the country's peace and safety, a power Adams held but, notably, never actually exercised against a single individual during his time in office. The Sedition Act went considerably further, criminalizing the publication of, in its own language, any false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government, and was used within months to prosecute at least a dozen Democratic-Republican newspaper editors, and even one sitting congressman, Matthew Lyon of Vermont, who served 4 months in jail for criticizing Adams's vanity and ambition in print. Jefferson and James Madison responded with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, arguing the acts were unconstitutional and that states retained the authority to judge federal overreach for themselves, an argument that would echo, uncomfortably, in far darker constitutional disputes decades later. Adams signed the Sedition Act into law and never vetoed or publicly repudiated its prosecutions, a fact historians have generally treated, since, as a genuine stain on his presidency rather than a defensible wartime necessity, regardless of the very real tensions with France that provided their original justification. Both facts, the peace with France and the Sedition Act's prosecutions of his own political critics, belong in the same honest account of the same administration. Adams lost the election to Jefferson decisively, further undercut by a Federalist Party that Hamilton's own faction had spent 2 years actively weakening from within. He left the presidential mansion in Washington before dawn on the morning of Jefferson's inauguration in March of 1801, skipping the ceremony entirely, a departure historians attribute partly to political bitterness and partly to grief, following the death of his son Charles to alcoholism only months earlier. A private sorrow that Adams's public correspondence from that winter only barely conceals beneath its formal language about retirement and rest. It marked, nonetheless, the first genuinely peaceful transfer of power between 2 opposing political parties in the nation's short history, a precedent historians would later rank alongside Washington's own voluntary departures as one of the young republic's quietest and most consequential achievements, achieved by 2 men who could barely stand to be in the same room with each other that particular winter. He returned to his farm in Quincy, Massachusetts, a property he called Peacefield, and remained there for 25 years, the longest post-presidential retirement of any president up to that point in American history, spending his days reading, farming modestly, and corresponding with a widening circle of old friends and former rivals as the country he had helped found continued changing in directions he did not always approve of. For roughly a decade after 1801, Adams and Jefferson did not speak, the bitterness of the 1800 campaign hardening into a genuine estrangement between 2 men who had once stood together in the same Philadelphia room arguing for the same declaration. In 1812, at the quiet encouragement of their mutual friend Benjamin Rush, Adams wrote first, breaking the silence with a short, almost testing letter that opened simply, "I wish you, sir, many happy New Years." Jefferson wrote back within weeks. What followed over the next 14 years was one of the richest correspondences in American political history. 158 letters exchanged between 2 aging former presidents and former friends and former rivals, writing candidly to each other about philosophy, mortality, religion, and the country they had each helped invent, and then argued bitterly over how to run. Adams's letters characteristically blunt and quick-tempered, even in old age. Jefferson's more measured and philosophical. The two styles somehow completing each other, the way they always had, decades earlier, in the same Congress. On July 4, 1826, exactly 50 years after the Declaration of Independence had been adopted, John Adams died at his home in Quincy at the age of 90. His last recorded words, by multiple eyewitness accounts, were, "Thomas Jefferson survives." Adams did not know, and had no way of knowing, that Jefferson had died at Monticello several hours earlier, that same morning. Two men who had argued a nation into existence together drifted into a decade of bitter silence and spent their final years slowly repairing the friendship in writing, died on the 50th anniversary of the document that had first bound their names together, within hours of each other, neither aware the other was already gone. The coincidence struck the country immediately as something close to Providence, newspapers across the still young republic running the news within days as evidence that the two men's shared founding work had been, in some sense the era's religious language readily supplied, blessed by exactly the kind of unlikely symmetry ordinary history rarely produces on its own. Adams did not live to see his own eldest son, John Quincy Adams, become the 6th President of the United States by a full presidential term. John Quincy had already served 3 years in office by the time his father died in Quincy, the only instance in the nation's first half-century of a father and son both reaching the presidency. A distinct legacy from Adams's own political career, but one that grew directly out of the same insistence on public service and rigorous education Adams had imposed on his children from the years he spent mostly absent, writing letters home instead of raising them in person. Go back, one final time, to the Boston courtroom this story opened with. A young lawyer, friendless in that moment by his own choice, arguing that facts are stubborn things and that the law owed even Boston's most hated men a fair hearing. He would make some version of that same argument for the rest of his life, in the Continental Congress, in the courts of France and the Netherlands, in a peace commission his own party despised him for sending. He was not always liked for it. His own generation often preferred Jefferson's warmth or Franklin's charm to Adams's blunt, occasionally vain, frequently prickly insistence on his own correctness, a personality trait Adams himself readily admitted to in his private diary, even as he rarely managed to soften it in public. He was, more often than the men who opposed him wanted to admit, correct. History's verdict arrived slowly, the way his own vindication over the peace with France arrived slowly, the way his friendship with Jefferson took 14 quiet years of letters to rebuild, the way the country itself took decades to fully reckon with the darker legacy of the Sedition Act, alongside the genuine accomplishment of the peace he had fought his own cabinet to secure. It arrived anyway. Facts, as the young lawyer told a furious Boston jury in 1770, are stubborn things, and stubbornness, across a lifetime of unpopular decisions, turned out to be exactly the quality history needed someone in that room to have.